everyone, and welcome to this episode, the Informal Learning One of the Women Talking About Learning podcast. I'm Andrew Jacobs. Before we start, hit that like and subscribe button on your podcast player. People find out about podcasts from people they hear, so make sure to leave a review and let everyone know what you think of what we're producing here at Women Talking About Learning. In the world of professional development, informal learning often plays a pivotal role in shaping how individuals grow and adapt. Our two guests today are experts at looking at the nuances of informal learning and its significance in contrast to traditional, formal training methods. We'll explore the transformative power of informal learning in the workplace. So to discuss this, like I said, two brilliant guests. Our first is Dr. Jane Bozarth. Jane has worked in the L&D industry for decades, most of it in the US state government. In that arena, she worked as a classroom trainer, e-learning designer, and training program manager, and has developed interest and expertise in inexpensive solutions to workplace performance issues, particularly those with social and self-directed components. That was followed by a stint as the Learning Guild's Director of Research. She is the author of several books, most recently Show Your Work, The Payoffs and How-Tos of Working Out Loud. Jane will also be co-hosting a new podcast, Show Your Work, with me that will be launching later this year. Our second guest is Nadia Khan. Nadia is a leadership and organisational development specialist with more than 20 years' experience across government, business and the voluntary sector. She has designed and led executive and high-potential leadership programs, managed learning across 5 Whitehall departments and supported organisations through growth, restructuring and cultural change. Nadia is also an executive coach, former Chief Impact Advisor at MindTools and Chair of the Digital and Technology Advisory Group at the Central London Careers Hub. Recorded at the end of June 2026, this is Women Talking About Learning. This is Jane and Nadia talking about informal learning.
How you doing, Jane?
I'm doing fine, thanks. I'm not as hot as you are, oddly
I
enough.
know it is.
London's having a heat wave.
Yeah, for the listeners who, depending on when they hear this, we are in the middle of, I think this is the second heat wave of summer, but I won't bore everybody with the general discourse and conversation that is going on at the moment about why the UK is so ill-equipped for heat waves. But for me, Jane, it is an absolute honour, by the way, to be chatting with you today.
Thanks.
I've heard some really wonderful conversations that you know kind of over the years been in and around, and especially on the topic of what we're talking about today, which is informal learning. You know, you're the guru on this, so I'm really looking forward to our conversation on this. Delighted to be chatting to you today.
That's great. What is your interest in informal learning? What do this topic light your fire?
Yeah, so I think it was really interesting when this kind of topic came up, and why I kind of put my hand up to have a conversation around this. For me, I think in many ways, I have always been a proponent of informal learning with unintendedly. That's where my natural kind of style and preference as somebody who's worked in L&D, leadership development, has always veered towards, know the models, know the frameworks, set up courses, done all of that structured work. But for me, the real kind of juices get flowing when people are in that informal space. It's what happens there in that informal space for me that has always been the most enjoyable part of it. And I think when we work in this profession, you are encouraged to create those formal frameworks, especially if you're working as part of an organizational structure or a corporate structure. But it's actually the informal learning space where the real learning takes place, because the behavior changes, because people are kind of taking ownership of it and almost not realizing that they're a part of it. It doesn't feel like they're being pushed through it.
Right. So I am delighted to be here as well. I do a lot of work with Andrew for one reason or another. Our paths we do get to cross now pretty often. And I will say, going back, I am flattered that you think I am the guru or the expert, but let me just say, everything I am, I owe to Jane Hart.
Absolutely. Yes, of course.
We used to make jokes about being the two Janes, and I would often refer to myself as the other Jane, and she's sort of stepped away. She's got a very busy personal life, but I have been interested. I think my interest and understanding that informal learning is an actual thing one can talk about and look at and discuss I was part of a very vibrant, active community of practice of other trainers back when I was a new one, stand-up platform people back in the day. And I learned so much from just being around other people who knew so much, right?
Yeah.
Just being in the world and living with them. And I think we can overlook how almost everything we know how to do, we learn by just moving on earth. We learn to speak languages. We learn to how to get along in school. We learn how to choose, choose between job offers. We learn which boss you can make a joke with and which joke you can't. And nobody sits
Absolutely.
you down and teaches those things, right? I worry, and I don't want to get myself in trouble right out of the gate, although I do it all the time. I worry that sometimes people in our business, we know all the theories, we know all the jargon, we know all the
That's it.
language, we know how we're supposed to scaffold and structure and organize and outline and deliver. But I worry sometimes we become a little bit precious about learning with a capital L. And if you can't sit people down and teach it and give them a quiz and measure it and tell the boss they can, I worry that we have sometimes can lose sight of the fact that adult human beings and children can go off and learn plenty of things perfectly fine on their own. They don't always define it as learning with a capital L like we do, right?
No.
I was telling Andrew just the other day, it's a long story, but I've been taking swim lessons. I can swim well enough not to drown. I
Yes.
would like to be a better swimmer than that. And one day I had really kind of struggled with the whole doing all the things at once, the kicking and the breathing and the turning the head and the not drowning part. And all of a sudden I got it. It clicked and I got it. And I was watching other people at the pool and somehow something happened, but I didn't stop and say, oh, gee, look, I just learned that.
Yep.
I said, oh, look, I can do that now. Oh, I get it now, right? It's not that we think about it as a cognizant, deliberate something that is happening. I was working toward it. And I guess we could argue that self-directed learning and informal can be very different things. In my case, maybe it was more self-directed learning, but my immediate thought, even as somebody who's been doing this for decades, was not, oh, look, I'm learning.
Yeah.
So, I'm very interested in this, but I think we got ourselves into trouble. I'm sorry, but I think LMSs made us start thinking every breath had to be measured and credited and tracked. And I think that
Yes.
bothers me more is people want credit for someone else having learned something. I don't know that we're focused enough sometimes on the end result that we're after. We're so busy.
I've got some thoughts on that,
Okay.
and I think I think you're right. I completely agree with
Mhm.
you, and I wonder whether some of that credit piece is to do with the fact that the profession sometimes is on the back foot, right? To justify the work
Oh,
that they're
yeah.
doing, the things that they're
Yeah.
doing. And as a result of that, if they can point to a formal program and say we've put this many leaders through this, and we think this was the baseline. I mean, I'm hoping that's the case. Often they don't set a baseline or know where they're starting from in order to do the measurement properly. But there is this kind of belief that unless we can prove that we're adding value to the organization, then that kind of unintended, as you say, that learning that is taking place the whole time, because the purpose of learning within the organization is also to help them to be able to do their jobs well, right? So if they're finding ways to do that within the organizational space and how learning is being created, then that's already doing its job, but they haven't got the proof to be able to point the red thread.
Right.
And that's where I think it's driving certain kind of it's driving that choice, being that actually if we go for something that's a bit more formal, we can prove that point.
The thing is that I worry, to your point, I think you're right. I worry that what is driving it, it's a little bit like the tail wagging the dog. We have all these things
Yeah.
that we can track now, so let's track those. And tracking how I did on a quiz 3 years ago does not say a word about my job performance now. We track all of these activities, but I don't know that we do a very good job of tracking outcomes and whether we're actually tied to improvement. We can produce reams of data. Here's pages and pages of data, but is Jane doing any better 6 months from now than she was when we first got her? One of the things I find especially interesting in this conversation, I don't want to hijack us off into data. We can go on from here, but I worked for 8 years for the Learning Guild doing research reports for them, a good number of which were surveys. We had to be careful not to over survey people. We had survey fatigue as an issue in L&D.
Yeah.
So we had to be careful how many we did, but we would do a survey about Are you collecting data? Are you tying that data to performance? How are you using the data? And very often, several disturbing things would come out. Many people were not, they had all this data, they had no idea what to do with it. They had a bunch of data, but they weren't correlating it with any kind of real outcome of real performance. Or they would say, we give all this data to management and they don't know what to make of it, or they don't use it. So, it's kind of a double whammy, but I worry that we're in this drive to gather the data. We're not doing a very good job using the data, or we're not getting the data that really could show our worth and our value, right?
Yeah, and I think there is also, it's quite interesting. And Jane, you mentioned there the work that you did with the Learning Guild, and so I came into the learning technologies industry because I started working with Laura Overton at Towards Maturity.
Oh my gosh, yes. Oh,
So,
Laura's the best. Yeah.
Laura, as you know, is very much around this kind of evidence-informed learning, and the benchmark was absolutely doing that. It was kind of collecting that data. What was really interesting was when we used to do something called learner surveys, and it was called the learner intelligence. And what we were finding was that when we asked people about how they were learning, both inside and outside the organization, it was really interesting. In some cases, people had access to the same subscription, say, of LinkedIn Learning. They were not using it within a corporate setup, but they were using it externally in their own personal space. And they were learning all of the time, as you say. They didn't call it learning, right? They were improving themselves. They were growing. They were doing that personal kind of piece. They were on YouTube learning how to plumb a toilet, for example, right? They were learning all. They were learning a language. They were doing something else. But something was happening to them when they came into the workplace where the mandated learning just switched them off. And because it was formalized in that way that this is your learning. So what we were talking about, the kind of self-directed, personalized learning, that self-determined learner that they were outside in their own personal space, they were not doing that internally. And a lot of it was because of their perception of learning within the organization, which was very much around the formalized piece. And this is mandated. There was also a bit of, I think, under the bonnet, there was a bit of, what is my organization trying to learn about me? As well. So there was trust issues as well. And I think, that's an interesting point as well.
Well, it's funny because I was housed around between beside HR for many of the years of I was in an L&D role in an L&D often department or organization, but we were some out of HR. And the HR people honestly believe, well, if we make it mandatory, that will make it sound important. Yeah. And everybody will understand they've got to learn this. And half the time it was just some policy being read to them.
Yes,
right?
Exactly.
Learning anything. Don't break a rule was the training. But it's very hard, I think, to help people get rid of that mindset. It's like making it mandatory pretty much sends up a red flag, intentional or not. It sends up a red flag that says this is going to be terrible and it has nothing to do with you and it's not relevant. And this is for us and not for your own benefit. So figuring out, making the course, making the product good enough that people, and we had this happen actually with a really challenging Equal Employment Opportunity Institute that we did back then. When we stopped forcing people, to go and started making it an appealing thing that other people went back to work saying, this was great and I learned so much and I can apply all this. Yeah. Once we recast it that way and got some good word of mouth, we didn't have any trouble filling it. And we weren't dragging people. They weren't angry about being there, which is the worst. We've got people who don't know why they're being sent to something, who are mad that they're having to take away from work to do, right? So I thought that was good. It's funny that you bring up personalization because I am wondering if learners and workers and kids maybe have started sort of demanding that things are more personalized. I was on the phone an hour ago. I am not making this up. I was on the phone an hour ago with my local gym. They're offering a balance class, a 6-week class that's extra pay, extra charge, that starts next month. And I have 3 women friends, actually a little younger than me, who have broken wrists from falling. Walking dogs, mostly. They've got splints, they've got springs, they got screws. And I want to learn, I can tell as I get a little bit older, I can stumble and not recover as quickly as I used to. I can be walking on an uneven trail like I like to do and notice that I have to pay more attention. So I wanted to see if this class suited me. And I bet I had 20 questions for how they were going to spend my time. I said, I don't need yoga. I don't want gentle yoga. I don't want people telling me to breathe.
Yeah.
I don't want you tell me to be calm. I'm just going to be anxious about being told. Right. And so she reassured me. She talked a lot about, oh, well, we'll educate about this. And we educated. I said, well, is this just lectures? Because I want balance exercises. And so I was very specific. And I don't think it's just because I'm a trainer person. I think it's because we have come to expect, I want to know exactly how you're going to spend my time and my money. And it better be what I want for my outcomes. Right. So
Yeah.
I wonder if that is a trend in organizations now.
I think it is a trend. And I think generationally, if we think about the newer generations coming into the workforce, that's only going to increase, because I can pretty much tell you that anything with mandatory and that written all over it is going to be pretty much of a switch off. And
Right.
I don't think it's just newer generations coming in. I think everybody, I remember we always used to say this when we did the surveys, that when people tell you they don't have time to learn, what they're really telling you is they don't value that learning. Because
Right.
we only give time to things that we value, right? And it's to your point, the personalization piece, right? If you feel like somebody is listening to you and understanding what your specific need is at that point, because that is determined by lots of different factors, which are, very, very different now. And platforms are surfacing up personalization, but they're not necessarily in the places where people are of the mindset to learn. As we know, that's half the challenge and the issue.
But does that speak to, is the increase in personalization, the awareness that some employees seem to be getting that there is personalization, is that driving an awareness of their own awareness of learning? Did that make sense? Are they starting to understand, this is how I learned something, this is not how I learned something, this won't be a good use of my time.
Yep.
I need this other thing instead. I mean, I'm hoping maybe that's a good thing.
I think
hadn't
it's a
really
good
thought
thing. I think it is
Okay.
I think that's where some of the challenge probably from organizations to the vendor space is coming, to say that, this is now our expectation. It's not as you say, a one size fits all, or you put everybody through the same thing. We have multiple people who learn in, if you want to add in things like neurodiversity, if you want to, think about all of the
Sure.
different kind of aspects that going on there. But I think, what we're both kind of touching around the same issue here, Jane, is in our conversation, is that informal learning is already happening in our organizations, right?
Sure.
And that's
Yes.
that's the thing. The question is, it's that it's not visible, and because it's not visible, that supportedness and that, so it's how we support it and share it is, I think, some of the big challenge. Because
Right. Well, I think too, I've been cogitating a lot lately on the issue, because so many people in L&D have started to panic that we actually have software that can build pretty good courses compared to us cranking out compliance stuff, right? When we start talking
yes,
about slips, trips, falls, I love to joke about fire extinguisher training, but it's a thing. What happens to the L&D person? I think we're going to start seeing a resurgence in more live, either live virtual or live on site learning events, learning experiences, because people, are wanting
agree.
that, and
Yeah.
we are recognizing that just cranking out, I make fun of it, but Tim Slade is a favorite on this side of the pond. I don't know how well known he is on your side. He may be very well known there, but he talks about people whose job is to move rectangles around on a screen. That's what a lot of us have been doing. And I
Yeah.
think we're going to see researchers. And one of the things about that, and this goes back to my many, many years dealing with social learning, is that when we bring people to a traditional training program, we are bringing them together for the content.
Mm.
And a lot of times we're giving them content they could get 1,000 other ways. They could read it, they could get it as an online course, but the real value of those experiences is creating interactions, creating relationships, making connections around the organization, understanding, oh, that's somebody I might need to know. Oh, we've had that same problem. Oh, well, this is what they did about that. And see, we are not always part of those conversations because we're busy setting up slide decks or something,
Yeah.
or they're having them out in the hallway in breaks. I think that L&D, we need to figure out how to be more part of those interactions and those
And also
conversations
how
and
to
plan
create,
better for them than just planning training.
create those spaces, right? I think
Yeah.
it's quite an interesting one. I wonder what your thoughts are, because I was thinking about this. I think you're right on the types of experiences we're going to be focused on, which is how do you bring people together? How do you create those spaces where if the courses can be created, the more kind of compliance training or other formalized training can be done, in quicker ways, frees up our time to do more face-to-face virtual. How do you feel about the whole kind of proximity piece? So where, people are in some cases working hybrid, not always in the office, or some are now fully back. So there isn't a consistent kind of experience now where everyone's in all the time, or they're just all remote. How do you feel from that informal learning process? How do you think that's going to play out? Is something I'd be about.
Well, it's funny. I just wrote a piece on LinkedIn about this. I published a piece about we have lost, in many cases, we have lost collision spaces. We used to literally run into people in break rooms. There was an actual water cooler.
Yeah, good word.
There really was
Yeah.
one. The smokers would be out on a stairwell somewhere, right?
Yeah.
And people go to lunch together. And now I think we've got to there's the devil in the deep blue sea is we've got some people I know literally are scheduled for Zoom meetings 8 solid hours a day with a half hour out for lunch. I mean, they don't want any more of that. But we aren't building any collision spaces for offline stuff. Like today, we were here 5 minutes early, chatting for a few minutes with Andrew, getting to know you. You and I hadn't really met. Making sure people have just a little bit of room to meet each other, to chat about what they like. I thought the opening question today was really interesting when he said, talk about why you care about this topic. I was introduced in a webinar just a few weeks ago where the host said, they didn't ask for my biography and 17 things I did and what books I had written. They said, what are you working on now? Which is way more interesting to talk about and made the other people on the panel more interesting to interact with, right?
Yeah.
So I think we need to be more deliberate. But let me go back to my example of people in class and what they're talking about and what they're saying to each other and what relationships and interactions are doing. We don't need to count that with hashtags, right?
Yeah.
There's still on the L&D person to say, oh, well, you had 10 minutes for a break. If they had that much time to learn about each other, then we should have an 8-minute break. We have to watch out for that too. So I do think we need to pay more attention to how we can build in informal opportunities. I love things like quick online talent shows or pet fashion shows, or show a picture of, something nobody knows you can do. I just a few minutes, 20 minutes, or post a problem, say, how many of you have had this problem? The other day I was doing a live session. I said, how many of you have had a head management tell you that we don't need to make that accessible because we only have one blind person? Or we don't have any deaf people, so don't worry about it. Every hand in the room went up. Every hand.
Yeah, absolutely.
Story about
absolutely.
that. Just something in common. Anyway, I'll shut up.
No, Jane, I think this is all really interesting. I think the other thing as well is, and I was thinking about this just before we were coming onto the podcast as well, as a good kind of example of where sometimes an organization can absolutely, for the right reasons. So those of you who know me, who are listening to this podcast, know that I used to work for Towards Maturity. Then we were a part of the Emerald Group, and we've been on a very kind of circuitous journey over the last kind of 7 or 8 years, through different mergers, acquisitions, and all of that. And trying to take an organization through that is actually quite challenging, and you build in kind of formal integration programs and structures. But my experience was those informal structures, and actually when we let go of the control of trying to push that message out that needed to get out, and allowed the organization to set up squads or informal communities of practice, it was actually so much more powerful. Firstly, it takes a lot of that just resource off of you, right, in terms of having to push those things through. But there was a real power in that community of practice piece. And for me, communities of practice that kind of come together on issues and problem solve and think about what they're learning about the experience are just so powerful. And that, I see those as quite strong kind of indicators of informal learning, because, you never quite know how a community of practice is going to self-organize. Where is the topic going to start? And we used to do this as a part of the Towards Maturity research community as well. We would bring the research and then kind of throw it into the community, as you know, and I'm sure you did that as well. But there is a real, as you say, if we free ourselves up from some of the things that are taking up our time and use the technology, to do that for where it's appropriate. There is a real power in also relinquishing and kind of letting go, which is a big part of where informal learning really thrives.
I agree. I was thinking while you were talking about communities of practice, one of the challenges is you use the word self-organized, and that's an important component. We could talk about that at another day. But the thing that people want to start them and control them defeats the purpose of having them, right? Or demanding that they get certain outputs. Well, now it's just a work group, and we got enough of those, right? Some time ago, and I will share this in the resources with Andrew, 18 Winger, who did a lot of work with communities of practice, was the subject of my dissertation. Did a wonderful, and I've published a truncated version of a wonderful grid, a table for charting, what are the value of online interactions. And it starts with, well, why Jane's on Twitter too much? Jane's on Twitter all the time. Well, first of all, Jane is meeting people that she finds enjoyable. Jane's having fun. And that's the first thing people miss. Organizations can't stand it. If you just want to talk to somebody because you enjoy their company and you're having fun and you learn a lot, and then it progresses like, okay, well, what is Jane getting from these communities? And I could prove that I was getting resources I could reuse. I was proving we were using artifacts, that we were generating stuff. I could prove what I was doing on Twitter and ultimately adding value. Are we seeing a change to performance? Is this affecting? I don't know that I changed my organization, but I could track my participation on Twitter. Now, I can't say 72% of my time on Twitter was productive, and I think AI is really driving that productivity train. And I couldn't say, well, I posted 27 things and it got me 14 interactions, these crazy vanity metrics. But I can go back right now and tell you a whole lot of things about Twitter that changed my practice for the better. And I think that maybe we lose sight of that.
And then funny enough, you're talking about Twitter, and it used to be a great place for really in-depth I miss that as well, for our community especially. But I think for lots of different communities, sectorally and verticals and all of those places. And I think right now within organizations, they've got community platforms and they've got things that they do there. But it's almost like the moment you put something on a platform that's run by the organization, you lose some of that freedom to speak. So there are spaces and there aren't spaces for people to talk. And LinkedIn is a really good example of this, isn't it? There's some great conversation on LinkedIn, and there's less so great conversation on LinkedIn in terms of that. And you learn a hell of a lot by things that other people have shared, resources that they've shared, insights that they share, and their experiences. And then you also can get massively kind of taken off the path from that.
Well, so much of it, there was a lot to be said for only having 140 characters. Right?
If you can't say it in 140 characters, yes.
But so much of it is self-promotion and people who are just humbled and honored to tell you what they did yesterday, which is fine, good for you, I'm proud of you. But if that's all you ever do. But so much of it now is obviously AI generated and scheduled weeks in advance, and there's no spontaneity. I also find that the people on LinkedIn are way too earnest for my taste. You can't joke, you can't be sarcastic, you can't sort of poke at a friend knowing something about them. It's just also very, very earnest.
Well, it's got a slightly convoluted personality, isn't it? Because you see some of that, and then people are like, well, this is a professional network. But as you say, you can still, the tone of voice can still be professional, but jovial and encouraging, and let's get a debate going, and let's poke the bear a little bit and get a conversation going. But yeah, you're right. It really, it can kind of swing. The pendulum can swing one way or the other, where people are sharing some very interesting things they shouldn't be sharing to very kind of vanilla kind of commentary and stuff.
Well, the jokes get lost. I have a friend who, rather than refer to his children by name on social media because they didn't ask to be famous, right? He's an author. He refers to his children as the goats, and you kind of have to know what he's talking about to participate in this kind. And people who have no idea, I don't like goats. I don't know why do you have goats? You have a farm? It's like,
yes. It's lost on them.
That's what we call them. That's why we call them kids, huh?
Absolutely,
Right.
absolutely. So what do we think about obviously just coming back to the women angle to this? So from a informal learning perspective, what do we think are some of the opportunities or challenges for us in this space in informal learning?
I guess I've never thought of it as being gender specific. I might need to think about it. You tell me what you think, and I'll think what you're talking.
So I was just thinking, the only thing I was thinking about as we were talking, because we've spoken about visibility, and I guess so for example, I'm a part of Women in Learning Group, which is run by the ex-CLO of Thrive and Helen Marshall, which is quite an active group here. It's a global group, but got quite a big following of women in learning in the UK, especially. And it's a very kind of, as we were talking earlier, self-managed group, and women have massively benefited from the learning that they're getting from it. It's been set up as it's a WhatsApp group, but it's got lots of different kind of communities within that and stuff. And I'm just thinking, that yes, people know about it, but from a visibility perspective, is there something to be said around where are there pockets within organizations where, say, for example, our female employees or underrepresented kind of groups as a whole are kind of coming together in that informal learning space, but again, they've got an extra barrier on top of the visibility barrier they've got. So that was one of the things that I was thinking about. Is there a visibility? And also where you do bring out visibility of what you're doing, is there enough, and I guess this isn't a gender piece, but is there enough kind of psychological safety within the organization to talk about what people are learning and where they're learning? It was just something I was thinking about from a particular angle.
No, I'm with you now. One of my particular flavors has been for the last decade has been about showing your work and the importance of, if you can do it, make your expertise more visible. How can you be known in an organization? How you probably have something someone else has been desperately looking for, but we don't know because you hide under a bushel. Well, and I had this conversation the other day about women. I when I was collecting, that was kind of a picture book full of examples. I don't know if you're familiar with my show Your Work, but it was a picture book full of examples. And I would find women were happily talking about hobbies. They were baking things and crocheting things and decorating cakes and knitting and making bread, lots of bread during the pandemic, by the way.
Of course.
But, one day I needed to talk with somebody about some sort of video question. I wanted to film something for the Learning Guild, and I needed to do a 2-shot of myself. It was kind of complicated, and I was looking for somebody who could help me. And a few names came to mind, and all of them were men. And they're all lovely men, and they're men that I know and respect. And I'm like, how come I don't know any women in this space? Why aren't there any women? I'm sure there are women doing video, but they aren't talking about it. I know if I want to talk to somebody about drone photography, I know 2 men I could ask about that. If I wanted, and it's that way about a lot of workplace topics. If I want to talk about cakes and crocheting, right, I can call one of the women. But when it came down to technical things or more work-related things, so I was having this conversation with a group of women friends recently, and one of them said, well, first of all, there was Gamergate.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And second, there is psychological safety that you brought up. So women who dare step up in some of these spaces just get beaten to a pulp. And I can't say that's not actually true, especially when I'm asking them to put it in the public sphere, not just in their organization, but I need to find it on LinkedIn. I need to find their blog post. I'm not in their organizations. So I think we do need to talk about what happens when women step up. I mean, look what happens when they put a woman in a male role in a movie.
Absolutely. God, outrage.
Yeah. So there's outrage. So I do think there's a legitimate something going on there that's beyond my can do to talk about today. But I was really kind of shocked that Gamergate came up because I tend to think of that as being so far in the past. But this was immediately, remember this happened, and remember what happened, and remember Kathy Sierra, and remember it was bad. So
but that's interesting, isn't it? Because that's lodged in there. That's like a warning signal, right? It's like a red flag in their head now. But it's a worrying thing that you don't want to kind of end up being a casualty of something like that if you do. And I think where the informal learning piece, as I said, that visibility piece, I think is quite important, because if that sharing and that bringing out, and as you say, show your work, which I loved as a concept, Jane, whenever I've read it, you talk about that, it's important, but showing your work is also that vulnerability piece, right? And not all
Yes.
organizations have that psychological safety around it.
Yeah, and it's why, especially like when people share something went badly, something that failed, something that didn't work, or they say, I need help with this. I've struggled with this. And I've seen a few of those lately coming up on LinkedIn. But, who are women? Who are these women in this business? What are their areas of expertise? What are they interested in talking about? I mean, I think this is the kind of thing that helps. I was at a big industry conference a few years ago, and I met a person who had appeared in one of my books with a tool for something. That's about all I can say about that. But they had sent me something I could include, and I gave them a shout out in one of my books. And I was going to a session that some of our friends who've been on this podcast were involved in. I was going to the session and the panel, and it was about women in learning, women in the industry, women in L&D. And a man who was in the room said he would be seeing me there and he was looking forward to it. And this author who I had put in my book said, well, you'll be the only man there. There's two things there. One is he was not the only man there.
No.
Two, that tells you something about the general view of some people. Three, there's a second edition of that book, and guess who's not in it? Watch me take my feminine power and work it on you, buddy, because you ain't in that book no more. Anyway, but it was like, you'll be the only man there. And I don't think that's true. I know men who watch this podcast,
Absolutely.
for instance, and I know men who are
Absolutely.
engaged in our conversation. I know men who are shocked when they hear that there might be women who are afraid to speak out about what they're working on or what they have knowledge of. So
yeah, and that's the thing, isn't it? Because if you are afraid to surface the things, it's that lost opportunity from an organizational perspective of, as you say, those pockets of really good, high quality learning, informal, changes in process. What organizations are looking for their employees to do, kind of transform. But we're missing out on those things if we're not creating that. And I wonder if some of this is also about leadership modeling behaviors.
Yes.
So modeling the behavior of how they learn informally, right? So how, as sharing the things that they've learned. I remember Ross Garner and I used to do the Mind Tools L&D podcast. He would always have a regular thing at the end, what I learned this week. And it was very much in this space of informal learning. None of the guests or us that ever came on and said, when I went on a leadership course or I, did a bit of compliance training, it was always, I read this book or I watched this documentary or, I came across this study or, I was speaking to a colleague who was, talking about this. So I think it's really interesting about the modeling.
Yeah. And first of all, recognizing that you have learned something so that you can share it is important. But years ago, and this is one of my successes, we need to remember things that went well. We were, because we were state government employees and we had this sort of churn of bureaucrats overseeing different things. Did one time, we had a manager who was all about these reports. She wanted reports. She wanted this report and that report. I suspect they went into a closet somewhere that no one ever looked at.
A drawer.
Well, one of them was, we had too many people, it would be just a drawer. There was one of the line items on it was research. And people would say, I read this book or I looked at this thing or I talked to this person. I got them to change that question to, what did you learn this week?
What did you learn? Yeah.
And people had to articulate that, had to write it down. And whether anybody looked at it, I don't know. But they became more cognizant of the fact that they were learning and that they needed to document that. So
you've shifted
but I do think, of all the things we've said today, I think the most important phrase has been psychological safety, which you brought up. I think that without that, nobody's learning anything much.
No. And in organization, and it's a tough place organizationally at the moment. People are worried about, they can see the opportunity of AI, they can see the opportunity of things, but how many restructures are taking place in organizations?
Right.
There's a lot of anxiety out there. So psychological safety, if organizations are serious about their employees or people within their organizations stepping up and kind of taking the mantle to learn and grow, then they need to create that psychological safety.
I agree. Well, and I think we could argue that leaders and organizations learn almost everything informally. They are not sitting down going to mandatory training. They are not
100% absolutely right.
So what's our takeaway? I want people to show their work. I want them to feel comfortable showing their work. I want them to figure out if you're a leader in an organization and people are not willing to talk about what they're doing and what they're working on and where they need help, why is that happening? I ask learning leaders to step up and look at how to make their organizations and open up the culture a little bit more to make it safer and encourage people to share and talk about what they're doing and give them some room for that. I mean, don't keep them locked into Zoom meetings with an agenda 8 hours a day. Don't keep them locked
Yeah.
into never being able to have some sort of collision space, either literal, on site or virtual. What do you think?
Absolutely. I agree with all the things you said, Jane. And I
Mhm.
would add to that from a kind of the professional and L&D perspective is before you build your next course, or your next program or your next framework, think about, where is the need really, and try to find out where the problem is and whether somebody's already solving it somewhere in your
Yes.
organization.
Yes.
Right. So I think it's become a bit of a detective within your organization to see what's actually going on, as opposed to just the formal bit that you are. And if you're not getting the connection there, and that's usually because people are finding their ways in and around the system to learn what they need. But they're also, through kind of not having visibility or transparency of that, you're also missing out on gaps that could be filled.
Sure.
Right.
Sure. Yeah.
And again, it's not always defaulting to, oh, this is a massive capability gap. Let's, put on 100 courses, put everyone through this. It's kind of, okay, so this is an overarching kind of capability issue. What's the way that we can work within the organization in an informal way and get people to organize themselves so they can, as you say, show their work, learn from each other, use that as a way to come back and challenge, critically use those skills to be able to improve on that and feel a part of the process as well.
Yes. Yes.
Because we've
Yes.
not really touched on that. As you said, there's so many different offshoots that we could go down, but feeling part of the process, I think, is something where, with formal learning, you are, however much you try to build into the design, you're limited by what you can do. Whereas
Right.
with informal, there is definitely more possibilities to get people involved in the process of building it.
Well, and I would say, and back to your earlier point, we used to Learn Chat was a very popular Twitter conversation for a lot of years. We did that for over a decade, and we opened that every week with "What have you learned this week?" And I
Yep.
think helping people recognize that they are learning and they have learned, and that they're doing it better this week than they did 2 months ago, and they did it differently 5 years ago, and that they figured something out. I think helping them, do say, "What have you learned? What have you been learning?" What have you just can help a whole lot. I know we're very, very short on time. That's probably my fault, but thank you very much for this conversation. This was just
Thank you.
so glad we got to meet.
Absolutely, Jane. And as I said, I've really enjoyed our conversation.
What a superb episode. I know both Nadia and Jane personally and had no doubts that this one was going to be exceptional. I loved how they framed informal learning as a powerful tool that organisations can embrace. By recognising its value and integrating it with formal training, we can create environments in which employees thrive and adapt effectively. As they said, the future of learning in the workplace isn't just about structured programs, but fostering a space where informal learning can flourish. A massive thank you to Jane and Nadia for their insights into this topic and for their time in making this such a brilliant recording. You will of course want to connect with them, and their details are in the show notes, along with information about how to connect with us here at Women Talking About Learning, and a range of links providing further information about the topics they covered. We'll be back in a couple of weeks, and next time it's the Organisational Cultures one. As always, thank you for listening, and we'll see you again soon.